But there is another side to Cooper's lifetime in aviation, one that for years he would only discuss with close friends, until now. It involves his personal encounters with UFOs. For him, it began in 1951 while flying in Europe for the U.S. Air Force. There, Cooper and other pilots witnessed an incident that has never been officially explained. A vast armada of UFOs flying in formation at extremely high altitudes. Recently, Yolanda Gaskin spoke with Gordon Cooper. In this exclusive interview, Colonel Cooper spoke for the first time on television about his encounters with UFOs.
I've read about this incident you had in 1951, and you said you saw literally hundreds of unidentifiable flying objects.
Yes, they were flying quite high. How high we couldn't tell because we couldn't get anywhere near their altitude. But they were either very large craft way up or smaller craft still well above what we could get to.
For a day and a half, all of this happened, but then no one wanted to talk about it.
Well, we sent a report forward on it, and the answer that finally came back months later was they were probably high-flying seed pods, which didn't sound very logical.
There are always a lot of excuses. There's always weather balloons. I've heard that one before. In 1951, you couldn't even get close to the things that were flying overhead. You or anyone else that was flying.
They were faster, higher.
6 years later, Cooper again encountered a UFO. This one definitely was not a weather balloon. While supervising flight testing in Edwards Air Force Base, his military camera crew actually filmed an unidentified saucer-shaped object landing near the site.
As they were sitting there filming, a little saucer came from, I say little saucer, it was a saucer, came flying over their heads, put down 3 little landing gear and landed right out on the dry lake bed. And they picked up their cameras and started over toward it, filming as they went. And when they got in fairly close to it, it lifted up, put the gear back in the wheel wells, tipped up, and took off at a great rate of speed. And so they came into my office and told me what had happened, and I sent them over to develop the film. And then had to go through all the proper regulations of reporting this. And we wound up having to send the film forward to Washington in the base jet airplane. And I don't know whether anyone's ever seen it since.
Now, the vehicle that you just described, how similar was it to the very first sighting that you had back in 1951?
Quite similar. It was basically the same plan-form vehicle. They were double saucer, lenticular. But if you're going to be going in and out of atmospheres like Earth or other places might have, you certainly need a little more aerodynamic type of vehicle. And the saucer has the capability of going through the air at tremendous rates of speed and handling the bow and trailing wave without making shock waves. So it can be very silent while traveling at big rates of speed through the atmosphere.
But sightings of UFOs weren't limited to the military. Cooper has commercial airline colleagues who've also seen UFOs.
Yes, a friend of mine who's a captain on a major airline at night was flying along, noticed this, suddenly a big glow came off his left wing, and he looked out and this big saucer was sitting right off their wing. And so he turned, slide toward, and it moved away, and turned back, and it moved back in position, and turned to his co-pilot and said, do you see what I see? And he said, oh, God, yeah, I do. And it trailed along with him for quite a period of time, then tipped up, climbed very steeply away. Was on Jim McDivitt's Gemini 7 mission, where they saw this glint of something metallic off in the distance. And he reported, and nobody had it listed on the ground, so he tried getting a picture of it, but the sun, unfortunately, was glinting off of it so bright, all you got is just a glint. There was no detail on what it was, but never any further sighting at all on it.
Years later, Cooper approached the United Nations with a proposal for a committee that would explore the UFO phenomenon.
All right, now tell me about the letter to the UN.
Well, the letter to the UN was in conjunction with a meeting that I had with Kurt Waldheim and the Security Council of the UN to try to encourage the UN to establish a committee to start comparing notes and data and information and to really look into all of this from an unbiased, neutral point of view.
Here's a quote from your letter. I believe that these extraterrestrial vehicles and their crews are visiting this planet from other planets and are obviously a little more advanced than we are here on Earth. And are you saying that's exactly why governments have been trying to keep this information private, because of that obvious advancement?
Very possibly, right.
As I understand it, in 1951 or 1950, you had a couple days of observing something usual flying over Europe?
Yes. We had some kind of craft flying overhead at pretty good altitude and flying the same kind of formation we fly in our fighters.
Were they planes? I mean, what
Well, it turns out they didn't have wings. They were saucer-shaped, and we never could get as high or as fast as they were, so to really positively identify them, but they were metallic-looking and saucer in shape, and they could do a few maneuvers that we couldn't do in an airplane.
What maneuvers are that?
Like just horizontally displace themselves rapidly. Be flying along and just move over rapidly.
And how fast were they moving?
Well, faster than we could in F-86s. So they were capable of accelerating very readily out, well past Mach 1 anyway.
Did you think they were experimental craft, or what was your initial thought?
Well, not knowing what was going on in Russia at the time, we were really at the height of the Cold War. We had no idea what Russia was doing, and we had no way of knowing whether they were Russian aircraft or whether they were something else.
After you were debriefed, what happened? Did they believe you, or?
It didn't matter whether they believed us or not. The report went on, I assume, was forwarded on to Washington.
If you could speculate, I mean, on what you saw and what they were doing, what would your, I guess, opinion be?
That there were a number of extraterrestrial vehicles out there cruising around.
Really? What do you think? I mean, what would you think were doing? Were they monitoring what you guys were doing, or were they just? I mean, what would you speculate?
No, I would say they were going somewhere, traveling.
Before this time, had you ever heard of any such incident like this occurring?
No.
No, really. I mean, what effects did the sightings have on your life at the time?
None.
None. It didn't.
No.
Lead you to believe, oh boy, there's.
Nobody made any big ditty about it or really thought very much about it at the time.
You wrote a letter to the United Nations in May of 1963. What prompted you to send that letter?
Well, I felt that everybody around the world was busy out being contacted from time to time and having sightings and a few abductions and various things going on. It would be nice maybe to have a central gathering house for all this information, and somebody who was some organization that was kind of neutral ground that wouldn't have vested interest from country to country involved. And it seemed to me like the United Nations still would be the place to do a lot of this gathering.
You mentioned abductions. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, where people were blacked out for a period of time and woke up and obviously had some time missing, and down so far as a couple of poor fishermen in Pascagoula, Texas, who were actually taken on board a spaceship, extraterrestrial spaceship, and these types of things that, whether you believe them or don't believe them, or whether they're true or false, the information really ought to be brought together in one locale and properly investigated and properly correlated and properly stored.
In your letter you wrote, I believe that these are extraterrestrial vehicles and their crews visiting from other planets. What led you to believe that?
That's just my opinion.
Your opinion? I mean, seeing, I guess, for the first time the craft, did that kind of prompt you to I mean, that, I guess, in your reading Buck Rogers, prompt you to believe that's what the situation was?
Well, in later years, after being in a fighter outfit for a while and getting into aircraft development, testing, and research at Edwards, I certainly had decided that we're not building that type of vehicle here, certainly not in the United States, and very likely not on this planet. So these vehicles almost of necessity have to come from somewhere else.
Again, referring back to the letter you wrote, we may first have to show them that we have learned how to resolve our problems by peaceful means rather than warfare. What led you to believe that? Was it just something that, I mean...
Well, one would wonder why extraterrestrials are not contacting people more readily. Why don't they come and land in my backyard or somebody's backyard who would dearly welcome them and who would like to interface with them and like to find out what they're doing, what their propulsion system is. And one would then take the next step and say, well, maybe it's because they don't feel we're ready. Maybe we haven't learned to control ourselves or learned to govern ourselves well enough to really be given more technology.
What did you feel about the outcome of the letter or the results? I mean, what did you feel once, I guess, nothing happened?
You hit on nothing. The outcome of the letter was that nothing happened, which of course is rather typical of the United Nations. But
would you write, if you had the chance, would you write the letter again? I mean, would you do it all over again?
I suppose I would. I suppose I'd do it again, but even knowing it probably would be a waste of effort.
Why do you think it would be a waste of effort?
Well, it wasn't really truly a waste of effort. Kurt Waldheim reviewed it and had a meeting with us and looked everything over, and it was presented to the council and certainly made a lot of people aware of a number of things that perhaps they had not been aware of before, so maybe it opened a few eyes.
You said, just a minute ago, you said the United Nations would be the place to do that. Why not some branch of the government? I mean, why not, one of the military or NASA, or why the UN?
Well, then, if our government handed it, there would be a few governments around the world that might have a reluctance to work with the program. If you had truly neutral ground, like the United Nations is supposed to be, and is pretty much so, it would be the logical place to do it.
That makes sense. I guess on the program Coast to Coast with Merv Griffin, you mentioned that you were previous to various... You need something? Oh, sorry. Getting in the lens there. You mentioned that you, I guess, were previous to various reports of UFO contact. I didn't know if that was first-hand information or you actually saw some sort of report, or...
Well, there have been a number of people who have been doing investigative reporting, and some good, some bad, and some indifferent, but there have been a number of incidents that have been pretty thoroughly investigated that were, I thought, quite interesting.
Can you give me an example? I mean, first of all, do you think they were credible? And secondly, do you have any examples? Or?
Well, I think some of them were very likely credible. I don't have any specific examples that much better than the other.
Let's see, where are we here? What was the response to your appearance on Coast to Coast? I mean, do you think you would do it again, or I mean, what was the public response? And were people interested? And were they like, wow, what, here we have an astronaut saying these?
Well, I didn't have, I didn't have a feel for any direct result of it, but I know that Merv Griffin felt that it was one of the highest responses he'd ever had to the program, so he felt that there was a lot of interest there.
I read also in doing research for this interview, there apparently was an incident that happened at Edwards Air Force Base. There was a film crew filming something. They came to you. They said, we've got something on film. It was really neat. And could you explain what happened?
Yeah, I had a film crew working for me on a project I was doing to put a precision landing system in on the edge of the dry lake bed. And they were filming the various stages of the installation. And a small saucer apparently flew overhead and put down some landing gear and landed out on the dry lake bed, only about 50 yards out. And these were old pro cameramen who were used to flying in all kinds of vehicles to take all kinds of pictures. And so they picked up their cameras and started over toward it, and going to get some close-ups. And with that, it lifted up, put the gear back in, and at a very high rate of speed disappeared. So they came in to tell me what happened. I told them to get over to the lab and develop the film immediately. And I would go and look in the book, regulation book, and see what you're supposed to do, who you have to call to report these kind of incidents, and, which I did. And by the time they got back with the film, there was a higher and higher and higher ranked man preceding the last one, assuring me that I had to get those negatives into a pouch, and that they had made arrangements already to get our commanding general's airplane reserved and take the films to Washington, which I guess happened.
Did you ever see the film?
I saw the negatives, yeah.
And what did you see on the negatives?
They were great pictures.
Of,
sure, they would have made great pictures from the negative.
and what was it, a small, large?
Fairly small saucer. It was hard to tell what size it was just in the picture, but it was a saucer-shaped vehicle.
And you said it had legs? Landing?
It had landing gear.
What color was it? I mean,
Silvery color.
so what do you think happened to the film? I mean, what?
I don't know. If I knew that, I'd be a very wise man.
We're just about done. We have maybe 15, 20 more questions here. Do you think the government knows more about this subject than we do?
Do I think the government knows more about that subject than we do? Yes, I think they know a great deal more than we do.
Why don't you think they say anything? I mean, why don't you say, hey...
Well, I'm putting myself in the place of the government, say, and realizing the fact that in about right after World War II, I had started telling a few little mistruths because I was worried that the public might panic over knowing there was somebody out there that had so much superior performance to us, to any vehicles that we can build. So I tell a little mistruth, and then later something else happens, and I tell another mistruth that covered the first one, and I wind up with whole stacks of these little mistruths that get more and more and more embarrassing. And each administration, as it comes in, has probably thought, well, gee, why don't we clean up this mess and admit to all of this, but how do I go about admitting it with the least embarrassment? And I think they're probably looking for a way of, with the least embarrassment, of getting out from under all this. Because eventually, you know, there's too many people who know what the truths are, and they're going to have to confess up to having misled the public for a lot of years.
Do you think they're doing it with you know, mankind in mind by, you know, I guess, you know, the average man has a 30-year mortgage, 2 kids, 1.5 cars. I mean, do they think he doesn't need to know about that, maybe? Or is it just...
Well, I think they probably started out with mankind in mind. I'm not sure whether they have mankind in mind or themselves in mind at this point in time.
That makes sense. Why don't you think people who perhaps work for the government don't come forward with, you know, proof, hey, this is what we're doing, you know? I mean,
Well, if you work for the government and you're out and you've been told not to say certain things, you no longer work for the government if you go out and say these things. So if you want your job, you do what you're told to do.
that makes sense. That makes sense. So I guess that would kind of lead to the question. I mean, do you think there's some sort of like cosmic Watergate? I mean, do you think there's some big secret that's getting ready to get burst and, or?
Well, I have no idea whether there's any great big secret ready to burst or not, whether it's things that have accrued and built, or whether it's just a normal evolution or what.
Has anyone ever come, you know, forward from either NASA or the government and said, hey, you shouldn't talk about these things publicly. It's not kosher, I guess.
No, I've never had anybody from the government ever come forward and tell me I should not talk about it.
This is the last set of questions here. Why do you think we haven't been back to the moon?
Well, we haven't been back to the moon primarily because of politics. We should have retained a senator by the name of Proxmire, who headed up some very powerful committees, had us destroy the Saturn V assembly line and cut up all the tooling rather than produce, say, one Saturn V a year and continue to have an occasional trip, we would have benefited tremendously as a nation and as a world by doing this. We should have long ago had a permanent station on the moon for doing scientific research, and we should long ago have landed a crew on Mars.
Why do you think, first of all, why do you think he had the assembly line cut up and destroyed?
I don't know why Senator Proxmire did the things he did. He destroyed the supersonic transport. He destroyed the dinosaur program. He destroyed the Saturn V rocket, and he canceled out our trip to Mars for we were going to do a manned 81 Mars landing, which he managed to cancel. I don't know whether he was carrying a card painted red from another country, or whether he just, in all good conscience, thought we should spend all our money on Wisconsin cheese. But he certainly was not a very big, I am not one of his fans, as you can tell.
Let's talk about Wisconsin cheese.
that was great.
That was great. In that same vein, let's talk about the dinosaur for a second. It's something you bring up because I was doing an interview in, I think it was the old Lockheed Martin, if I'm correct, boardroom. And there's a picture of what looked like, you probably know, you obviously know more than I do about this. It was a small model off in the corner, and it looked kind of like a very small space shuttle with the wings. It kind of had, I guess, inverted wings. And I asked them, what was this? And they said, well, it was a craft. It was, I guess, codenamed Dinosaur, and I either piggybacked or taken up in the upper atmosphere, and then let go. And apparently, it just went straight up into outer space, and then.
Well, it was a vehicle that would fly like Mercury did in space, but instead of using a parachute for landing, it had aerodynamic effect. It was a winged vehicle. In other words, an airfoil-shaped vehicle that would come in and land on a runway. And it was a worthwhile program, and I can't really fault the decision to cancel it totally, because there was some conflict between it and Mercury, and Mercury was a simpler program that certainly got off the pad well ahead of Dinosaur. And Dinosaur had a lot of delays, and finally got to the point where there would be a conflict between it and Mercury.
So you don't know why, I guess, they didn't want us to land on Mars. I mean, is there any other reasons that you could think of? I mean, they didn't, you know, why not? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. I mean,
well, when you say they, you're not talking about all the technical people who were involved in the Mars program and who could be involved in the Mars program. There are a lot of technical people who firmly believe that we should have long ago have been on Mars, and that we definitely need a manned mission to Mars now.
But I mean, one senator, 20, 30 years ago saying we're not going to go. I mean,
well, obviously, some politician may have a vested interest that this particular program may conflict with his vested interest.
I see. The last chapter of questions here. Do you believe, we kind of covered this, but it was on the other tape, do you believe, I guess, there's life on other planets out there?
Yes, I believe firmly that there's life on other planets out there. I think we'll find that there are probably hundreds of other planets that are habitated, and that there are all levels of civilization. Some maybe at the same level we are, others that may be thousands and millions of years ahead of us in development.
Why, in your mind, have they made contact with a select, I guess, group of people, or do you think there's any been contact that's gone on?
Yes, I personally believe there's been a lot of contact that's gone
on. Unlike yourself, I guess, do you think there are any other astronauts who may have had similar experiences with extraterrestrial craft?
Yes, I know one or two have. Unfortunately, when you say astronauts have had contact, people think you're having it in space. In space, to my knowledge, McDivitt's was the only one that could be even possibly an unidentified object. And other than that, all these stories that were made up and sold to people like National Enquirer and so on were totally fictitious. And I've had any number of things written up about and reported by me of conversations I've had with extraterrestrials while on orbit, and sightings that I had in orbit and I was told to shut up about, all these kind of things that were made strictly to make money on print.
What happened to James McDivitt? I mean, do you know? Or?
Well, they never could determine what it really was. The sun was glinting so on this metallic object so brightly you really couldn't tell from the pictures what it was or wasn't. And he never saw it again, so no one to this day knows. But there have been other astronauts who've had contact from, flying airplanes. So.
Why don't you think they've come forward? I mean, is it something they just don't want to talk about, or?
Well, maybe they think there's not really that much to talk about yet until we get contacted by somebody. And
speaking of that, what do you think will happen to mankind when that ultimately happens? I mean, when?
Well, I think we'll see vast progress when we get the capability of really learning. People who can develop that kind of propulsion systems very likely have very advanced medical systems that can cure everything we have wrong with mankind today.
And do you think it's just a technological advantage you will make, or do you think there'll be some sort of conscious?
I think we'll progress both technologically and in our consciousness.
Yeah, maybe even a spiritual thing. People will say, "My goodness."
Yes, I think very likely.
Do you think there would be any type of hysteria? I mean, since you've seen one of these objects, I mean, do you think mankind is ready for such an incident now, or?
I think mankind is really pretty much ready for this now. There may be isolated cases of hysteria that are hyped and built up, but I think man on Earth here is pretty much ready to receive man from somewhere else.
If you could sum up your experiences with these craft in just a few sentences, what would you say?
Great performance.
No, I mean, if you could say, while I was in Europe, I saw, X amount of craft. I mean, I'm trying to look for what I'm looking for some log lines. Basically, while I was in Europe, I saw X amount of craft or flying here or there. So, how would you kind of sum that up in a sentence or two?
Well, while I was in Europe, I saw some craft that certainly were very advanced over any of the craft that we have been flying and are presently flying. It would be nice to be able to build some of that kind of performance and to be able to go to the places where they go to.
How are we on tape?
Good.
Okay, I just got a couple more questions. If you were, I guess, if a child was to ask you, do you believe in UFOs and have you seen one? What would you say to a young impressionable mind? What would you say to them?
Yes, I do believe in UFOs. I believe that there's too many other places that people could habitate, other planets, to none of them be habitable. And I believe that they're coming here to visit us on occasion, or coming here for whatever reasons they're coming here.
Is there anything on the subject that you haven't already said that you'd like to say for the first time? I mean, any kind of revelations or beliefs or misconceptions that are out there, that people may have said about you, or it's kind of a last chance to say something, I guess.
Oh, I guess not.
Revelations.
I just have one question. Talking about going to Mars, what do you feel that a manned mission, what in your estimation, or what was in the scientific community, what were some of the things that they thought that they would see and that they would experience or find there?
Well, as far as Mars is concerned, the unmanned missions that we've put there, which have been great, they've been good ones, really haven't told us definitely whether Mars was habitated by humans or not. And it is neither disproved nor proved, either way. And there are many, many questions about Mars as far as what the water is, the water situation from the past, that we think we know that these are probably big river washed gullies that are in it. Do we have, since we have ice caps on both the poles, do we have an area where the temperature is more suitable for life? Will we find people there or not? I mean, there still is a possibility we might find somebody hidden in these caves back along these gullies. But the point is that on the lunar missions, the unmanned vehicles we sent up there sent us back a tremendous amount of data before we ever sent a manned one. But the manned missions yielded over 1,000,000 to 1 yield over what the unmanned ones did, just because the human brain still is smarter than that unmanned little vehicle. And the unmanned vehicle is only as good as the designer knows to make it. That little unmanned vehicle only asks for certain things that he's been told to ask for, and if anything unexpected happens, he doesn't have the capability of reason.
Makes sense. Speaking of Mars, have you seen, I guess, what they term the face on Mars? Have you seen that?
Mm-hmm.
Pictures and the structures? What do you think? What do you think that is? I mean, do you have any idea?
I don't know. It's interesting looking, though, isn't it?
It sure is. I had a chance to look at that. I go, wait, this is weird. What is that?
I don't know whether it's just something caused by natural erosion or whether it's something like our big Nazca pictures down in South America, that were carved out of the whole mountaintops.
That's it.
That's it. That'll do it.
Thank you so much.